Some stories don't just pass through you, they stay beneath your skin, changing the way you feel every heartbeat. It always begins the same way, a look that sees deeper than the surface, stirring something that hasn't moved in years. Then comes that slow, burning pull, magnetic, undeniable, where every breath feels like it's already been written somewhere in the stars. Before you even understand it, skin meets skin, breath melts into breath, and a single night begins to feel too small to hold what's unfolding. These aren't the stories you easily forget, because they aren't just moments of passion, they are awakenings. Welcome to a place where love is fierce, intimate, soul, deep, and unforgettable. If you've ever believed that the right touch, the right look, the right night can rewrite your whole world, stay. This is where hearts remember what they were made for. Steam curled lazily from a half-finished cup of coffee, rising into the soft hush of a kitchen that had known far too much silence. The table was familiar, worn smooth by years of quiet mornings that passed without incident, yet everything felt strangely new the moment another presence filled the doorway. It wasn't the sound of footsteps that shifted the air, it was the feeling of being seen. The kind of seeing that made the heart stutter for a beat too long. Eyes met not by chance, but as if summoned, held just a second too long, with something unnamed flickering in the space between. The loneliness that had lived in that kitchen didn't crumble loudly. It softened, melted, slowly receded under the warmth of a gaze that carried both question and promise. There was no touch, not yet, but somehow the body remembered the idea of being wanted before the mind had time to catch up. Shoulders straightened, breath caught. Everything inside grew unbearably aware of posture, of distance, of the slight tremble that came from simply being noticed. Words were spoken, simple and everyday, but carried on voices that trembled slightly under the weight of what was not said. Hands moved with sudden distraction, wiping non-existent crumbs, adjusting a spoon whose position did not need adjusting. These were the small betrayals of control that happened when desire awakens unexpectedly inside a room built for routine. Heat gathered in places long left cold, a warmth that had more to do with closeness than with temperature. A laugh slipped out, unplanned, turning the air lighter and somehow more dangerous. It wasn't just humor, it was an invitation wrapped in a sound. What came back wasn't a laugh in return, but a look so intent it seemed to settle just under the skin. That look traced every line of the face sitting across the table, lingering at the mouth just long enough to make that mouth part ever so slightly, a soft intake of breath, almost a sigh. Imaginations brushed up against each other like passing fingertips. A thought of leaning in, a thought of tasting, a thought of what would happen if neither of them pretended this was nothing. The clock ticked, mercilessly loud now that awareness had taken over. Fingers drummed not with impatience but with restlessness. Every small move was suddenly charged, reaching for the coffee pot, brushing past to grab a napkin, standing just close enough for clothing to whisper together. The fabric against fabric created a spark so subtle that it could be denied, though neither heart truly tried. A shoulder brushed a forearm. The point of contact burned as though kindling had been struck with a single match in a room filled with unseen fuel. It could have ended there, an almost moment left to fade, but something deeper wouldn't allow it. The next time eyes met, there was no flinch, no polite retreat. What stared back was a truth laid bare. Something inside gave permission. Slowly, deliberately, one of them stepped forward while the other remained still but open, making no move to break the fragile tether. No words, no pretenses, just proximity aching with promise. The kitchen light overhead was harsh in the way realism sometimes is, but even that couldn't strip away what was blooming in the shadows of two bodies that were drawing closer. Hearts slammed against ribs, unsure whether to leap forward or run away. But feet didn't move except inward, barely an inch at a time. enough to feel breath warm, uneven, laced with anticipation. Hands hovered near shoulders, near cheeks, near hips, uncertain where to land first. That hesitation made the impending touch more potent than touch itself. When fingers finally made contact lightly along the curve of an arm, the sensation flooded through like warm lightning. A tremor spread quietly from that single point, and both bodies stilled as if afraid too much movement would break the delicate balance keeping this moment real. A shiver wasn't hidden, a sigh wasn't smothered. There was no longer any need to pretend the loneliness hadn't just been rewritten by the magnetic pull of another's hunger. Tenderness anchored the fire, grounding it in something more frightening than desire, the possibility of being truly cared for. Lips parted again, not for words. Eyes remained locked, unblinking, drinking in every twitch, every softening. One brave inch forward and foreheads nearly touched. Noses brushed, breath mingled. The taste of coffee remained in the air as mouths hovered just shy of surrender. When lips finally connected, they met not in haste, but in trembling reverence, soft, slow, exploring edges, tasting caution and courage all at once. Each gentle press giving shape to a vow even before either realized a vow was being made. The kiss deepened, not with urgency, but with certainty. Hands found the curve of a waist, the strength of a shoulder, pulling ever so slightly closer. The world outside that kitchen ceased entirely. There existed only warmth, mouth to mouth, heartbeat to heartbeat. The counter pressed against hips, but grounded the moment. The table that had known only solitude now bore witness to two souls, rediscovering what it means to be alive in another's touch. When breath was finally pulled back, lips hovered again close enough to brush, as words trembled to be spoken, but couldn't quite form. What had awakened could not be silenced. Eyes still held the truth. Fingers still threaded into hair or trailed down sides as if afraid letting go might return everything back to silence. The warmth lingered between their bodies, alive, pulsing, undeniable. No promise was given. Yet everything about the way they stood spoke promise. Everything about the way their bodies leaned subtly toward each other, even in stillness, declared a new chapter had begun right where an old story of loneliness had once ended. It wasn't eyes alone that lingered now, but everything heart, skin, breath, hope. Because sometimes all it takes is a spark in the most unexpected place to set two lives ablaze forever. It started slowly. The kind of slow that doesn't feel dangerous at first. A soft brush of fingers, a laugh that lingered just a bit too long. A glance held a second past what would normally be polite. At first the mind pretended not to notice, telling itself it was nothing more than coincidence, kindness, innocent connection. But the body knew before the heart was ready to admit it. Something had already begun burning quietly beneath the surface. The way he hovered nearby, not intruding, just staying close enough that the warmth of his skin could be felt without contact. It was almost unbearable in its restraint. Every time those fingertips grazed an arm, or his breath slipped a little too close to a cheek, sparks shot through places that hadn't felt alive in years. It wasn't the careless desire of youth. It was something sharper, muddier, terrifying. Because it held the power not just to awaken, but to undo. Eventually even the accidental touches stopped pretending. His hand stayed longer when it brushed against a wrist. A thumb traced slowly along the knuckle as though memorizing a secret. He didn't pull away first anymore. Those dark, hungry eyes stopped darting nervously and began to stare with open want. Each touch was asking a louder, braver question. Are we really going to pretend we don't feel this? The moment lips finally met skin, it wasn't bold. It was almost gentle. The softest brush at the corner of the mouth, barely there, but it felt like a storm tearing through the marrow of bone. It was impossible then to hide how the body reacted. how breath hitched, how fingers fisted to stop from shaking, how heat flooded every hidden place until it hurt with wanting. A hunger ignited, not the kind that asks permission, but the kind that devours boundaries. There was a split second where a chance remained to turn away, a final moment to be reasonable, but he leaned in instead. He pressed harder, claiming space that had never been offered to any man so boldly before. That kiss was not innocent. It was a confession, a soft, desperate kind of confession that said "I want" in a way that made it impossible to form any kind of refusal. Once the line was crossed, there was no gentle inching forward, only crashing revelation. Fingers threaded into hair, pulling the kiss impossibly deeper until breathing was a struggle. Hands gripped at fabric with growing impatience until it felt like the whole world was reduced to this frantic need to feel skin against skin. Every time his mouth moved lower, grazing along a throat, tracing the pounding pulse, emotion tore through nerves like lightning. He kissed with hunger, but also something far worse, something that felt like worship. It made resistance feel not only impossible, but foolish. Somehow that worship was even more dangerous than desire because it touched things buried deeper than flesh. When hands finally slid beneath clothing, the sound that escaped did not belong to control. Nails dug into shoulders, hips rose from instinct. There was no longer a question of whether this should happen, only how much more could be taken before the world fell apart entirely. The more he touched, the more something unleashed from inside. Something long forgotten, wild and burning and unapologetically alive. What should have been shame instead felt like powerful surrender, and every time his whispered voice begged for more, something inside answered yes without fear. His hunger pulled each breath out like a prayer, and the body gave without hesitation, falling, breaking, rising all at once. Even through the chaos of limbs and sheets and half-stripped clothing, there were moments so soft they hurt. The way he kissed a shoulder blade like it meant something sacred. The way he breathed her in like scent was air. The way he whispered her name like it was the only word he wanted to know for the rest of his life. Nothing about it was reasonable. It was reckless, burning, impossible to explain, and yet it felt terrifyingly right, painfully right, the kind of right that shakes foundations, ruins rules, and rewrites futures. By the time dawn threatened to crawl over the windowsill, everything inside had already changed forever. This wasn't just physical desire. It was the kind of connection that brands itself into skin and soul alike. The fear wasn't of what had been done, only of ever losing the way it made life feel. Because when hunger meets buried fire and both surrender to it, there is no forgetting. The rule was always to be careful. Always think twice. Always wait for the right place, the right time, the right permission. But that night, none of those rules mattered. There was something in the air that tasted like danger and desire mixed together, something electric that hummed beneath the skin. It began quietly, a glance held too long, a breath that trembled instead of staying steady. Then suddenly everything was closer, hotter, louder, hearts thudding against ribs like wild things trying to break free. The kitchen was barely lit, only the flicker of a small bulb above the stove casting long shadows, but somehow that made it even more intense. Every curve of light against skin, every shifting shape, felt secret and sacred. Hands found their way without hesitation, moving with the certainty of hunger long denied. The counter pressed against the back, cold and hard, while his body radiated heat that seeped straight into bone. Fingers tangled in hair, tugging just enough to make the pulse under the jaw jump. Breath hitched, caught somewhere between a gasp and a whisper. There was no patience, only purpose. Lips collided like they had been waiting a lifetime to crash together, urgent, desperate, tasting, claiming. Teeth grazed tender flesh in ways that sent sparks down the spine, and whispered sounds slipped out, half-formed and raw. The world felt narrowed down to this one room, this one moment, Everything outside those walls vanished. The future didn't exist. The past didn't matter. Only here, only now, only the fire rising higher. Bodies moved like they knew exactly how to fit, every angle pressing, every curve answering. The rhythm wasn't choreographed, it was instinct, pure and fierce. The quiet clink of dishes shifted on the counter as hips drove forward again and again, deeper, harder, needing more. Heat pooled low, coiling tighter with each motion until it was unbearable, yet still it built, refusing to break too soon. Hands roamed greedily, nails leaving faint trails over shoulders, down backs, across ribs that rose and fell too fast. Every touch burned, every sound urged more. The air grew thick with the scent of sweat and want. Breath mingled hot and harsh. Somewhere in the sensory blur, time distorted. Seconds stretched into eternity, then snapped forward as desire sharpened. The flickering light caught on the sheen of damp skin, highlighting the curve of a neck arching back, exposing everything. His mouth found that vulnerable place and latched on with soft brutality, sucking until the skin darkened. A mark left behind, proof, a brand of this moment burned into flesh. A tremor started low in the belly, spreading outward like a flood. The pace faltered for a heartbeat just long enough for eyes to meet. What looked back wasn't just lust. It was something deeper, something rawer, reverence, worship. A silent question that didn't need words, and a silent answer that said yes, yes, yes. Then the rhythm resumed with new intensity, bodies grinding, rocking, chasing a high that promised oblivion and rebirth in the same breath. When release finally came, it tore through with unstoppable force. A cry shattered the hush, hands clutched tight, muscles clenched as waves pulsed through. The body went rigid, then shuddered over and over, collapsing against him as though the bones had melted. He held firm, arms locked around waist, chest heaving against back. His own release followed seconds later, a groan ripped from deep inside as he buried himself to the hilt, surrendering everything. For a moment, neither moved. Nothing existed but the pounding pulse still ringing in ears, the way limbs trembled, the way hearts thudded in sync. Eventually breathing slowed, though legs remained weak. He pressed a kiss to the damp spine, gentle now, reverent where moments ago he was ravenous. Slowly, reluctantly, they untangled, clothing haphazardly restored, though skin still buzzed and lips still tingled. But even as hands fell away, something lingered, not just on the body but in the heart, a knowing that something irreversible had happened here. Lines had been crossed, rules had been shattered, and yet there was no regret. Only a quiet certainty that this night would never truly end, because it had carved itself into the deepest part of the soul. And so even long after the flickering light stopped swaying, long after footsteps moved back down familiar hallways, long after silence returned to that kitchen, the memory stayed like a heartbeat echoing under the surface of ordinary life. Because what happened here wasn't just an act of desire. It was the awakening of something that refused ever to fall asleep again. It didn't happen in a rush of wild, reckless longing. It built itself quietly, like a fire that chose to grow in secret places. Flickers of warmth where only cold had lived, tiny sparks that no one else could see, not even the two caught inside it at first. There was something delicate about the way it began, almost cautious, as though whatever was forming knew it needed to stay hidden until it learned how to breathe on its own. Every meeting left behind a trace of heat, not just on the skin, but somewhere deeper. A look held a second too long, a whisper shared too close, something soft awakening in the chest without asking. It wasn't about hunger, real hunger devours quickly. This was a stirring, slow and subtle, leaving behind a sweetness that clung under the skin, making ordinary moments feel dangerously lit from within. There were smiles that tried not to mean anything, touches of fingers that lingered too long on purpose, short exchanges that left entire worlds of emotion echoing in the silence afterward. The heart started to beat differently. It didn't crash or thunder. It pulsed like a secret, steady and sure, calling to something that had been silent too long, reminding the soul of what it used to believe in. When closeness finally happened, it wasn't explosive. It was deeper than that. Slowly, carefully, piece by piece, warmth filled the space between two bodies until it became impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. The sound of breath replaced words. Hands learned their way gently. Mouths spoke in kisses that were soft, reverent, patient, as though both knew what they had found was too precious to be handled any other way. The heat of it wasn't wild, it was sacred. It asked neither for promises nor explanations. It asked only to be felt, to be surrendered to, and the more it was allowed, the deeper it rooted itself. Even after the embrace loosened, even after clothes were straightened and walls were rebuilt again to face the outside world, that glow remained, not a burn, not a scorch, just a quiet warmth under the skin. Days passed as if nothing extraordinary had happened, and yet everything had changed. A certain softness took hold at the edges of every routine. Little things triggered that secret memory, the brush of fabric, the smell of a familiar soap, even the sound of footsteps approaching unexpectedly. The body remembered without permission. The soul hummed with something gentle and alive. Perhaps the most powerful part was realizing it had never been about hunger at all. Hunger fades the moment it's fed. But this only grew. Every time distance tried to cool it, something inside pulled warmer, brighter, softer. It wasn't a craving, it was an awakening, something that said, "This is what it means to be alive again." There were moments when doubt tried to creep in, whispering that it should be simple, that it should burn, explode, and end like all forbidden fires do. But this flame seemed to have a different purpose. It existed not to destroy or consume, but to restore, to remind that love can choose the quietest path and still leave everything changed forever. What happened behind that closed door became more than memory. It became a pulse that beat just beneath the surface of everyday life, hidden from the world but undeniable to the heart that carried it. And long after the moment passed, long after the goodbye, it lived on like a sweet echo that would not die. Because it was never only about desire. It was about coming back to life.